We're fortunate today in having Peter Nolan here. In fact, he got here about 9:15, 9:30, and sat down with us in the warm-up group. We had a wonderful time with him and his friend. And as a matter of fact, he's been here before, as many of you may know, because of his book before called News Stories, which is outstanding, by the way. And he's here to talk about another book today. He was a television news reporter with a career in Chicago, MAQ and WBBM TV. Spent the 1960s, the 70s and the 80s. He won 3 Emmys and several journalism awards, including Chicago's Magazine Best TV Reporter in 1979. He's the author of the critically praised Campaign, the 1983 election of that rocked Chicago. His second book, News Stories, a memoir that was published in 2018. He's a native of Buffalo, New York. Began his broadcast career at WHLD Radio in Niagara Falls, New York, and then he also worked at WKBN TV in Youngstown, Ohio, before arriving in Chicago near the end of the turbulent 1960s. On May 3, 2019, Peter Nolan was inducted to the Silver Circle of the Chicago Midwest chapter of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. The award honors television broadcasters who've given more than 25 years of outstanding service to Chicago. And he continues to give outstanding service by coming here and talking about his revision of his latest book. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Peter Nolan. Thank you.
Jim, thank you very much. That's the beautiful remarks. I haven't had so many kind things said about me since many years ago. I gave a speech downstate and the MC was sick and I had to introduce myself. So thank you for that. My book is about an election in Chicago in 1983, when Harold Washington became the city's first Black mayor. It was a monumental event for the city and for the African-American community. A young community organizer named Barack Obama knew what happened. He packed his bags and came to Chicago on a journey that would take him to the US Senate and to the White House. My book is about that election. I was a reporter who covered it, but let me back up about 15 years to give you a little sense of the times. If you're old like me, you lived through the period. I don't see too many young people here, but they may have heard about it or read about it, but most of us here were around when it happened. I got to Chicago in 1968 on a Saturday, March 30th. There was a war raging in Vietnam that was becoming more and more unpopular, especially among young men of draft age. The country was divided over the war, young versus old, hawks versus doves. The country was also divided racially, and there were riots in many of our cities. The Presidential Commission said there were 2 societies in America, one black and one white. Does any of this sound familiar today? And you know, when I came here, we found we decided, we had 4 little kids at the time. And it was 1968, and we decided we were a little leery about moving into the city of Chicago because of all the trouble that was going on. And so we found a really nice little house in Glencoe, just down the street. And it was a great place to raise children, Glencoe. I found out later that being Irish Catholic, in most of Chicagoland, you were in a majority, but in Glencoe, an Irish Catholic was in the minority because Glencoe was a very heavy Jewish place, but we loved it. made friends for the rest of our lives. And we eventually attained honorary Jewish stature. And the only thing is that, but later we had 6 kids. It got kind of expensive with all those bar mitzvahs and bar mitzvahs. There's a lot of gifts going out a few years anyway, but we had a great time. One of my sons is raising his family in Glencoe. Anyway, the second day I was in Chicago, March 31st, President Lyndon Johnson went on national television to say he would not seek re-election so that he could devote all his energy to try to end the war. The next day, I started my new job as a writer at NBC in Chicago. In the middle of that week, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered in Memphis, and there were riots in Chicago and other cities across the country. In June, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles. In August, the Democratic Convention came to Chicago. I'm sure you've seen some of the pictures of police beating up demonstrators. One study afterward described it as a police riot. And if you were young in those days and were downtown and you had long hair, there was a very good chance that a cop might hit you on the head. In November, Richard Nixon was elected president, and he eventually ended the war in Vietnam. Throughout all of this in Chicago, the big story was Mayor Richard J. Daley, the last of the big city machine bosses. He micromanaged city government of the Democratic Party of Cook County. It was said he knew hundreds of city workers by name, and he knew who their sponsors were. One of my favorite Daley stories involves an alderman of a South Side ward who died in office. One enterprising precinct captain's heard from a policeman friend that the exact time of Mayor Daley's arrival at the wake, this enterprising guy wanted to replace the dead alderman. So he stationed himself outside the funeral home. A favorable nod from the mayor would be golden. When Daley got out of the car, our man confronted him. "Mr. Mayor, I'd like to take the alderman's place." Daley stopped, looked the man in the eye, and said, "You need to talk to the undertaker." Richard J. Daley was elected to a 6th term in 1975, but it wasn't to last long. On December 20th, 1976, the mayor appeared at the dedication of a new park, but he wasn't feeling well, so he went to his doctor's office. And the doctor, after an initial exam, said he needed to be in the hospital. When the doctor left the room briefly to make arrangements, Daley placed a call to his son. During that phone call, the mayor collapsed and he was gone. He had groomed no successor, left no instructions. But for a long time after, you couldn't be around City Hall very long before some minor official whispered in your ear, "You know, right before he died, the mayor told me I was to be chairman of such and such committee, or he wanted me to be a deputy commissioner of aviation." Now, my book focuses on the events after the mayor died. A deal was made to make a man named Michael Blandick the acting mayor until a special election the next year. Blandick won that special election, and it looked like he might stay mayor for a long time, except for a 100-year snowstorm that hit the city in 1979. It paralyzed Chicago. I remember we were supposed to walk to a New Year's Eve party a couple of blocks from our house, and we couldn't do it. You couldn't walk, let alone get a car out. The Blandick administration made a series of blunders in trying to deal with the problem. In February, a woman named Jane Byrne defeated Blandick in what was described as the biggest political upset in Illinois history. Jane Byrne became the first woman mayor of Chicago. Her administration was a roller coaster ride for the next 4 years. There were frequent firings and hirings. It was the end of the Jimmy Carter presidency. The economy was in bad shape and the city's finances were a mess. So in 1983, Jane Byrne had opponents in her reelection bid. One was Richard M. Daley, son of the late mayor. The other was Congressman Harold Washington, pride of the city's African-American community. Harold Washington would prevail in the Democratic primary and then defeat a Republican challenger in a very close general election. So the book is about this highly charged, raucous, wild campaign and election. A political campaign, if any of you have ever been in one, can be a great drama, especially when it's close and competitive. And there's a lot hanging on it: people's jobs, careers, business contracts, power. It doesn't have to be for mayor or president. It can be for the town council, maybe Northfield. If the chemistry is right, then a great drama unfolds. People work hard. It's an emotional experience. Tears flow when it's over. And if you happen to be on the losing side, it can be heartbreaking. As Jane Byrne said after this campaign, it's like a death in the family. In the primary election, 1,300,000 Chicagoans voted. Harold Washington won with 36% of the vote. Mayor Jane Byrne was second with 34%. Richard M. Daley ran third with 30%. I should point out that Washington won even though he had a couple of negative marks in his history. His law license had been suspended for failing to perform legal work for which he had been paid. He served a jail term of about a month for failure to file income tax returns, even though his birthday was April 15th. For decades, it was a foregone conclusion that the Democrat would win the general election in April. But this time, the Democrat happened to be black and the Republican opponent, Bernard Epton, was white. For the first, I think at this point, I'm going to have my friend, where is she?
I'm here.
Oh, yeah, run our little, we have a little video of this campaign.
Yeah.
Thank you.
During the 70s and 80s, Chicago was the most racially segregated big city in the United States of America. Even though areas became predominantly black, there were white overseers who would really control the political power. There was a spirit of rebellion in the air.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harold Washington.
I grew up in a segregated city thinking that African Americans were never going to get the opportunity to rule and to govern. And Harold Washington changed all that forever.
I've watched the city of Chicago destroyed by petty politics and bad government. I have been urged by the earnest pleas of thousands of people to enter this race. Therefore, I hereby declare my candidacy for mayor.
Earl wasn't taken seriously. None of this was taken serious.
How are you? I don't want to be mayor unless you do your homework.
I wasn't getting covered outside of the African American community.
Okay, the schedule is 9 o'clock.
We did not have any money.
and we were pretty low in the polls.
We have 670,000 black registered voters in this city. And we have never argued that we wanted anything short of a coalition. But when you get right down to it, the votes are here. They're here. They're here.
And push 9 for Harold Washington.
There was a groundswell, and all you had to say is Harold was coming.
Rain, snow, sleet, or shine, we're going to the polls to punch 9.
You want him? You got him.
Good evening. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. The results of Chicago's three-way race for the Democratic nomination for mayor today took many in that city and the nation by surprise.
I proudly and humbly accept the nomination as the Democratic candidate for mayor in 1980.
And now stands a good chance to become the first black mayor of the nation's second largest city.
People were beside themselves with excitement. I think a lot of people thought that City Hall was going to turn black overnight.
When Harold won in the primary,
some of my friends all decided that, hey, we got to get behind Epton, who was a Republican.
the vast majority of the Democratic machine became Republicans overnight.
How can I explain this? We were just going to have a low-key, small campaign, and now all of a sudden we have 1,000 volunteers, where the day before we had 10.
On April 12th, Chicagoans must choose one of two men to lead this city.
Which one do you think should be Chicago's next mayor?
Well, it hurt. It hurt. And we shouldn't be surprised. Nobody turns over power willingly.
And I think the Lord will forgive all of you for voting Republican just one day.
I've never seen an uglier, more racist campaign.
Someone had spray painted on the church, and nigger died.
I've got the people of Chicago with me, and that's what counts. But I need your help.
Epton for mayor before it's too late.
I became so enraged, and I filled out a volunteer card. And then I was a poll watcher for Harold Washington. And we won our precinct. And my life changed forever.
Will you join this cavalcade of this massive coalition and help to clean up and redevelop our future communities? Will you help me? Will you join me? You want Harold?
I, Harold Washington, do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States.
It was a seismic event, a historic event.
Congratulations, Mayor.
Obama was a trailblazer, but Obama stood on Harold's shoulders.
I had just gotten out of college, and part of the reason I think I had been attracted to Chicago was reading about Harold Washington and the inspiration that African Americans across the country had taken from his election.
Thank
So
you.
what happens then is that some of his people said, we're going to cut them off at their knees, meaning us. Strip the chairmanships from them, strip the power from them, the patronage from them, take everything they got.
The battle went down as soon as Harold stepped in to City Hall, which became known as Council Wards.
The President recognizes Alderman Terrace.
I move we adjourn.
You've heard the motion. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. Council is adjourned.
After a 2.5-day honeymoon as mayor, Harold Washington's first meeting with the city council almost became a palace coup.
We want Harold
called here too, but he ran away.
Mr. President, may we proceed with the business of this city council?
It was going to be all or nothing. We controlled the votes.
When will you recognize us, sir?
You're out of order, Mr. Nolan.
When will you this whole procedure is out of order the way you're conducting that shit.
There were a lot of things that the mayor of Washington wanted to do that we blocked. His appointments and who came up, we didn't pass them.
Shut it off! Tell him again! You're afraid of the truth!
The political opposition was basically trying to keep the government from operating. A form of political terrorism. It's a hostage taking, with the entire city of Chicago the hostage.
They called it Beirut on the lake. I mean, in national newspapers. It was ugly.
Your point of order is right. Recognized, sir. The clerk will proceed.
It was a test of wills. It was a struggle for the soul of Chicago.
It was about race, but it was more about power.
It was about power.
He opened the door to folks in a way that it will never be shut again.
If a historian were to have written a brief account of your administration and what you achieved, what would you hope he would write?
He would probably say this: that was a turning point. That was a turning point.
Thank you. That little video is from a documentary film called Punch 9, which was Harold's ballot position, and it was produced by Joe Winston of Tallgrass Productions. And as you can see, the race angle was really hyped a lot in the media. And it didn't help when you saw that commercial that Epton aired it with the tagline, "Epton before it's too late." To this day, many of the pundits believe the election of '83 was all about race. And one of the most reasoned analyses came not from a political expert, but from a professional psychologist who had an inner city Chicago practice. Dr. Theophilus F. E. Green, a consultant with Associated Psychological Services and himself an African American, wrote an op-ed piece in May of 1983 in the Chicago Tribune that was headlined, "White Racism Charges Overblown." Dr. Green said that Washington had some serious liabilities, which many voters were justified in choosing not to overlook. Washington's failure to provide services for legal clients was the most serious, according to Dr. Green, and those charges against his professionalism were as justified as if he were a doctor charged with amputating the wrong leg. He pointed out that Washington had threatened to dismantle the decades-old patronage system, and then expected party regulars whose lives and careers depended on the system to embrace him with affection after the primary. The election tallies indicate that in most interracial neighborhoods where racial culture clashes were not as strong, Washington did far better than he did in those that have always been predominantly white. There were other white people who had a lot of good reasons not to vote for Washington, yet chose to overlook them. I don't think they did it for his color alone. His color alone would not explain his stand on the issues, his powerful executive presence, and his moving oratory of concern for the common man. Washington has come into office with a different mandate than others who have held his position. He basically asked to be judged on his own terms and won a very heated campaign despite personal, political, and traditional setbacks that would have stopped hundreds of others. For a Black man, that has so rarely been the case. The election is not so much a triumph of Blacks and cosmopolitan whites over traditional prejudices, but the power of an individual to be accepted on his own terms by us all. He is thus a true American original, formed by the clay of his own hands, the American dream in action. It will be interesting to see what buildings he builds, what trees he plants, what roads he paves, and where they take us. And I want to end with just a little excerpt from my book. That is one of my, it gives you an idea how I was captivated by the characters in this story. Not just the candidates, but the people behind the scenes. This incident happened right before the general election. And I'm quoting from the book. Bernie Nystein sat in his law office on LaSalle Street, just south of City Hall. It was April 1983, a week before the election for mayor. I went to see him because I didn't have a clue as to who was going to win this thing. A casting director at 20th Century Fox could not have produced a better caricature of the old-time Chicago ward boss. Nystein was burly, his bald head rested on his shoulders like a medicine ball. There was no sign of a neck. A large unlit cigar waggled in his mouth. He looked a little like Edward G. Robinson, only 100 pounds heavier and tougher, and he was smart. Bernie Nystein was a native of Chicago's West Side, and as a little boy, his father took him to political meetings at a place called Guyon's Paradise Ballroom. That's how he caught the political bug. In school, he had a natural gift for the violin. He was 17 years old when he entered law school in 1934 and graduated #1 in his class. He became a precinct captain in the 29th Ward. He was good at it, delivering the precinct 603-3 for Richard J. Daley in Daley's first primary election for mayor. Nystein had been a paratrooper in World War II and won a battlefield commission. He went on to become ward committeeman and a state senator in Springfield. He stayed on as ward committeeman long after the 29th Ward went all black, maintaining an address on West Harrison Street while living in the posh Carlisle, where Michigan Avenue meets Lakeshore Drive. The day I saw him right before the '83 primary, Bernie was 66 years old and retired from politics. He told me he had a violin lesson that afternoon. Late in life, he had resumed his boyhood passion and was playing local recitals and concerts. We reminisced a bit about his days in the legislature. Quote, "There was so much bullshit flying around down there," he said, he had to go into the men's room for a breath of fresh air. But I was anxious to get his opinion about the current campaign. "Bernie, who's going to win this thing?" I asked. "Washington," he replied without hesitation. "How do you figure?" "He's going to win." "But Bernie," I argued, "what about the income tax and all that stuff?" So he didn't pay his bills. People in this town can identify with that. He's had a brush or two with the law. He's been before a grand jury. He didn't file his income tax returns. He had to do a little time. This is my kind of guy. "You really think he's going to win?" I persisted. "Nystein, yeah." So thank you, and be happy to have a little discussion about this great campaign.
We're going to see if there are any questions from those in the auditorium first. Will you raise your hand if you have a question? And I think Jim has a microphone.
I have a non-working microphone.
Well, we can fix that. I'm going to ask Don Packard to unmute himself. And
here we are.
Okay, well, first we have something from Fred. If you have a question, and then we'll go to Don Packard. Go ahead, please. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, put your hands up if you have any questions, please. And we have one. Hang on a second, please.
As I recall, the council was opposed to him, and he didn't have any votes in the council. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I can. And I should say, just I didn't get into that in the book because the book is basically about the campaign and the election. And I retired from broadcasting in 80, I think it was right after he was elected for the second time. But what happened was Edward Verdoliak was able to muster a majority of 29 on the city council. And they pretty much fought for 4 years. It was, they called the New York Times, or I think it was, or the Wall Street Journal, called Chicago Beirut on the lake. And so they were fighting, and it was kind of like politically, Harold, I think they both kind of relished the fight because Harold kept his constituency. The African-American community liked to have this guy knocking down these old white ward bosses. And so it went on. And at some point, they started having private meetings for Doliak and the mayor at the mayor's apartment, because they had to do certain things with this, minor things that had to be done, and they needed a little cooperation. So, but at the end of his term, there was a redistricting. You hear a lot about it now because we had redistricting in, was it 2020, every 10 years with the census. But he was able to, in redistricting, he got a majority on the council. So, and then he got reelected, but right after his reelection, he died.
Any other questions here? Back to you, Ron, and those online.
Oh, there's one back.
There's one,
Jim, there's one
Jim,
back.
behind you, there's another gentleman with a
excuse me, sir.
question from
I'm
the
sorry.
auditorium.
Sorry?
Who succeeded Harold Washington when he died?
When he died, there was a guy, he was a black alderman. Yeah, he was Sawyer. Yeah, his nickname was Mumbles, Eugene Sawyer.
Thank you. Any more questions, please?
Okay, Don Packard, you have a question for our guest.
I do. It's not exactly on the mayor's race, but I heard Peter say in his prologue that when President Lyndon Johnson decided not to run, Nixon became the president, and that Nixon ended the Vietnam War. Could you elaborate on that? Because I understand that we could have ended the Vietnam War much earlier. Johnson had a deal, and Richard Nixon and Kissinger talked to the Vietnamese president. Don't take the deal from Lyndon Johnson. We can end the war quicker than he can. And we ended up losing the war. Can you want to comment on that, Peter?
Well, I can. I'm really not an expert on that. When I basically mentioned that because that's what was going on, and I really don't. I'm not. I really am not aware of that. I do know that the war ended under Nixon. Basically, I know that now. Some deals that were I'm not aware of and not sure of, to be honest with you.
We do have other questions. Go ahead, Don, if you have anything else.
Yeah, I don't,
What did Bolandic do after he lost the election to
Bolandic-
Jane Byrne?
but Bolandic, he got married when he was the mayor. He married a beautiful blonde society woman named Heather Morgan. And he at some point he got appointed, or he got elected to the Illinois Supreme Court, and he became the chief judge at one time. So, and he died in office. He was not, I think he was in his early 70s. He was a marathon runner, but I'm not sure whether he had been on one of the lower courts before, but that's what he did after he was also he had gotten into public life after becoming a very successful lawyer for, I think, a Skokie firm. I want to say the company was Anitsberger. You're talking about the golf course. I'm not certain of that, but it was he was their general counsel or their lawyer when they were growing, and they became and he made a lot of money with them. And then he decided to get into politics.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you.
We're going to go to the chat questions. How do you, Peter, how do you feel Mayor Harold Washington would have approached the crime increase experienced in Chicago if he had been mayor now?
I think, he was from the old school of politics, and I think he would have said, you got to do something about it, and you got to crack down. I don't think he would have been soft on, like it seems to be today. You have one side wants to let everybody go and, take everybody out of jail and not give anybody any harsh punishment, low bond. I don't think he would have been for that. But who's to say? There's a lot of old politicians that are have gone far to the left.
Along those lines, Peter, what local politicians would have been more like a Mayor Washington today that you see maybe in Chicagoland?
Oh, you're talking about the people out there today?
Yes.
I don't know. I really have lost a lot of interest in I just what I know about Mayor Lightfoot. She doesn't seem to be too popular. But she certainly doesn't remind me anything about like Harold Washington. I'm trying to think who some of the other ones. I think she's going to have some competition from some Hispanic aldermen that seem to be pretty articulate and are kind of for law and order in the city.
Yeah, for sure. Our politics have changed quite a bit. But what's piquing your interest now? The last question that I'd have here on chat. What are you working on now, Peter? What's your next project? What would you like to do next?
I'd like to go to Florida in January. No, it's an interesting thing. I'm still trying to write. I've got some stuff. I've told my kids I'm looking over all my old intellectual properties that might still be viable. But I started a book similar to the memoir that I've done. And it's called, my memoir was called News Stories. And the book I'm trying to write, I've been kind of slow on it. is called That's Another Story, in which I add a lot of these old stories that I remember. And so I'm trying to do that. I got a screenplay that has been sitting on my computer that I had out in Hollywood once. And I had some producer insisted while I was trying to finish this book on Harold Washington, and he wanted me to write the screenplay. I said, I can't write that. I said, I wrote a play that didn't do too well. That's it. And he said, no, you got to write this. So I said, I'll give you 20 pages. Well, I wound up and I got the sole screenplay. And then the guy said, no, it's more of a novel. I think he couldn't sell it. So I got that sitting on my computer. I'm trying to sell some of these odds and ends that I got, and trying to do a little writing and get to Florida.
Yep. Peter, you have a wonderful experience, and we're looking forward to you sharing that with your writings and maybe coming back again.